A foreign doctor, a surgery, a death. And in less than 6 hours, her name appeared on all of South Korea's biggest news headlines as a criminal. But it wasn't her fault. The man she loved stood before the cameras and confirmed all the accusations. That night, she sat weeping by the Han River, leaning on the shoulder of a complete stranger. She didn't know that this man was hunting down the very people who had just ruined her life and had waited for this moment for 15 years. Please like and comment the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't leave, because what happens next will be unbelievable. The morning Avery Bennett ruined everything started the same way every other morning had started for the past 19 months, with bad coffee, a 12-hour shift hanging over her head, and the particular low-grade dread that came from working inside a building where nobody ever said exactly what they meant. She drank the coffee standing up in the break room on the 4th floor of Hansol Medical Center, watching the city come alive through a window streaked with last night's rain. Seoul in early autumn had a way of looking clean from far away. Sharp rooftops, pale sky, the Han River catching the first light like hammered silver. She had stopped finding it beautiful the way she once had. Now it just looked like a city, like any other city where she'd been the only American in the room. The coffee was from a machine that charged 1,200 won and tasted like hot water filtered through burnt paper. She drank it anyway because the alternative was nothing, and she needed something to hold. Her hands were steady. She'd made sure of that years ago. 11 years of emergency medicine, 4 in Baltimore, 2 in Houston, 3 in Chicago, and now this, whatever this was, had cured her of most sentimentality about her own hands. They were instruments. She kept them steady. That was the arrangement. She rinsed the cup, put it back on the rack, and went to find Julian. He was outside the scrub room on the 6th floor, already gowned, reviewing something on a tablet with the focused stillness that had first made her notice him. Dr. Julian Kwan moved like a man who had never once in his adult life been surprised by anything. It was either the most attractive or the most unsettling quality a person could have. 19 months in, Avery still hadn't decided which. He looked up when he heard her, smiled the particular smile that was just for her, or she had always believed it was just for her. "You look tired," he said. "I am tired. The Yun case is scheduled for 9. Gallbladder, standard lap col. Should be straightforward." "It's always straightforward until it isn't." He handed her the tablet. She scanned the patient record. Park Yun-soo, 63 years old, mild hypertension, no prior surgeries. The imaging showed exactly what it should show. She handed the tablet back. "Who's on anesthesia?" "Seo Min-jae." She didn't say anything. Seo Min-jae was senior staff, well-regarded, the kind of doctor other doctors deferred to in hallways. She had worked with him twice. Both times she'd noticed he moved a little slowly during the pre-op checks. The kind of slowness that in some people was caution and in others was habit calcified into carelessness. She had not said this to anyone. "Something wrong?" Julian asked. "No," she said. 9 o'clock. She went to prep. The surgery suite at Hansol was newer than anything she'd worked in back home. Clean angles, good light, monitors that didn't flicker. She'd had to relearn the feeling of working somewhere that looked expensive, because expensive and safe weren't always the same thing, and the habit of trusting equipment based on how much it cost was a habit she'd broken early in Baltimore and had to consciously resist rebuilding here. Park Yun-soo was already under when she entered the suite. His daughter was downstairs in the family waiting area on the 2nd floor. Avery knew this because she'd spoken to the daughter, Min-ah, 31. Nervous in the particular way of people who'd spent their lives managing a sick parent and had gotten good at hiding how scared they were. The first hour went exactly as it should have gone. Julian worked with the precision she'd spent 19 months watching and still found difficult to fully describe. There was no wasted movement, no hesitation. His hands were steadier than hers, and she acknowledged this privately and without resentment because it was simply true. She managed the field, monitored vitals alongside the anesthesia team, kept the rhythm of the room. The problem announced itself quietly, a small drop in blood pressure. She noticed it before anyone else spoke. "Pressure's dropping," she said. The anesthesiologist, not Seo Min-jae, she realized, but a resident named Park, who was covering for him, a fact she was only learning now, confirmed the reading and began adjusting. Julian didn't pause. The drop was within manageable range and the adjustment should have been enough. Except it wasn't. Avery felt the shift in the room before the monitors confirmed it. The quality of the air changed. She had been in enough rooms when things went wrong to recognize that change, the way some people recognize the smell before a storm. "We need to move faster," she said. "It's stabilizing," Park said. "It's not." Julian glanced up. His eyes above the mask were unreadable. "Avery, the vasopressor isn't holding. Something else is going on. We need to look at—" "I hear you," Julian said. His voice was the voice he used when he wanted to end a discussion without appearing to end it. "Let's keep the room calm." She kept working. She watched the numbers. She did not raise her voice again because raising her voice would have made her the problem, and she had learned this the hard way in rooms just like this one in cities that weren't Seoul, that when a woman raised her voice in a surgery suite, she became the story. Park Yun-soo's pressure dropped again, and then it dropped faster. What followed was controlled chaos in the particular style of controlled chaos that happened in rooms full of competent people who had just encountered something they hadn't prepared for. Commands. Counter-commands. The specific, awful sound of a crash cart being moved across a floor. They worked for 40 minutes. It wasn't enough. At 10:23 in the morning, Park Yun-soo died on an operating table that cost more than most people's annual salaries, in a hospital that had been named one of the top 10 medical institutions in Asia 3 years running. Avery pulled off her gloves outside the suite and stood with her back against the wall and breathed. She did not cry. She had not cried after losing a patient in a long time. What she felt was heavier than crying, a cold, settling weight in her chest that she had no name for and had stopped trying to name. Julian found her there a few minutes later. He didn't touch her. He stood a careful distance away, which she noticed. "You did everything right," he said. She looked at him. "What happened with the anesthesia coverage? Why was a resident running that chair?" "I'll look into it." "Julian, why was a resident—" "I said I'll look into it." He said it quietly. The way he said things when he'd already decided the conversation was over. "Go clean up. I'll handle the family." She let him. She shouldn't have, but she let him. She went downstairs 2 hours later to find Minna herself, because she felt she owed the woman that much, and found the family waiting area empty. A nurse told her Dr. Kwan had already spoken to the family. Another nurse, passing in the corridor, gave Avery a look she couldn't quite interpret, something between sympathy and the specific discomfort of a person who knows something they're not going to say. The rest of the afternoon was normal. That was the thing that would come back to her later, how completely normal the afternoon was. How she saw patients, reviewed charts, ate half a sandwich in the break room, sent 3 messages to her mother that she didn't receive answers to, and did not for one moment suspect that by nightfall her name would be synonymous with murder in every major news outlet in the country. It started with a notification on her phone at 6:47 p.m. She was in the elevator, heading to the parking structure, and her phone buzzed with an alert she'd set up years ago. A vanity alert, really, one of those searches that pinged whenever her name appeared online. She'd set it up in her first month in Seoul, back when she'd been naive enough to think good press might travel, that doing good work in a visible institution might generate the kind of recognition that made career building easier. She tapped the notification. She read it once. She read it again. She got out of the elevator on the wrong floor and stood in an empty corridor and read it a third time, with her phone held in both hands because one hand wasn't enough to keep it steady. The headline was from a news aggregator that pulled from 3 major Korean outlets. The translation was rough but clear. Foreign doctor's negligence kills prominent patient at Hansol Medical Center. Insider sources reveal falsified credentials, ignored warnings. The attached image was of her hospital ID photo, the one she'd had taken on her second day, looking slightly too serious in the way of a person determined to make a good impression. It had been cropped to remove the Hansol badge. It looked like a police photo. Her hands, for the first time in a very long time, were not steady. She called Julian. He didn't answer. She called again. Voicemail. She sent a message. "What is happening? Call me now." and stood in the empty corridor and watched her phone because she was certain he would call back within 30 seconds. He didn't call back. She took the elevator to the ground floor and walked to the main entrance and pushed through the glass doors and found, in the dusk outside Hansol Medical Center, approximately 40 people who had materialized with printed signs and enough anger to fill the parking lot. The signs were in Korean. She could read most of them. One of them had her name on it. Another had her face. The same ID photo, printed large, with something written across it in red that she read and then immediately stopped reading. A camera swung toward her, then two more. She went back inside. The next 3 hours were the most methodical dismantling of a human life she had ever witnessed, and she had the surreal experience of watching it happen to herself in real time through the glass walls of a conference room on the 8th floor where hospital administration had put her. For her safety, they said, which was how she knew the safety being protected was not hers. She watched the news feeds on her phone. The story changed with each refresh. New details appeared that she could not account for. Documentation she had never generated, timestamps that contradicted her memory, a quote attributed to an anonymous surgical nurse that described her as agitated, combative, dismissive of concerns before the surgery. She read these things and felt a dissociation she recognized from the worst nights of her residency. That feeling of being simultaneously inside your own body and watching yourself from a very significant distance. A lawyer appeared, not her lawyer, the hospital's lawyer, and explained in careful English that the board was convening an emergency review and that in the interim it would be in everyone's best interest if Avery suspended her duties pending investigation. You mean I'm suspended? Pending review. Those are the same thing. Dr. Bennett? The lawyer had the expression of a person performing sympathy that they did not feel. This is a very sensitive situation. Julian arrived at 9:15. She had been waiting for him for hours by then, and the waiting had cured her of most of what she'd felt when she'd first seen the headlines. The shock, the vertigo, the irrational conviction that this was some kind of mistake that would correct itself. What remained was something colder, sharper. She recognized it because she'd felt it once before, on the worst night of her residency, when she'd realized that the attending who'd been undermining her for 6 months wasn't going to stop. He sat down across from her. He looked exhausted. He also looked, she noticed, like a man who had been preparing for this conversation. I need to know what's happening, she said. The board is... Julian, not the board. What is happening? He was quiet for a moment, a long moment. She watched his face for the thing she was afraid of finding there, and found it. The anesthesia coverage failure, he said finally. It originated with a procurement decision made 3 months ago, cost-cutting. They reduced staff, changed medication suppliers. There were memos. The board didn't want those memos to become the story. So they made me the story. He said nothing. They made me the story, she said again. And you... What? You agreed. You helped them. I didn't help them fabricate anything, but you didn't stop them. The silence that followed was long enough and heavy enough that she understood, in the particular way you understood things you'd been afraid to look at directly, exactly what his silence meant. He hadn't stopped them. He'd had the choice to stop them, or at least to complicate their plan, and he had made a different choice. She could see it in the set of his jaw, in the way he was holding himself, in the careful distance he maintained across the table. There are 500 people who work in this hospital, he said. If this brings the institution down, don't. Her voice came out flat. Do not finish that sentence. Avery? Did you go on camera? He didn't answer. Julian. She could hear something happening to her voice. Not breaking, the opposite of breaking. A hardening, a compression, the way metal sounds when you strike it too hard. Did you go on camera and confirm what they're saying about me? I didn't confirm the specific. Did you go on camera? The answer was in his face before he opened his mouth. She stopped looking at him. She looked at the wall behind him instead, which was a pale institutional gray and had nothing on it, and she breathed. She breathed for a very long time. Get out, she said. I think we should get out of this room. She did not watch him leave. She kept her eyes on the wall and listened to the sound of the chair moving and the door, and then nothing. At 11:30 p.m., they gave her a cardboard box and told her to collect her personal items from her locker. A security guard accompanied her, not aggressively, not with his hand on her arm, but present. And that presence told her everything about how fully and completely she had become a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be spoken to. She put her things in the box. A stethoscope, 2 pens, a photograph, a spare set of scrubs, a book she'd been reading for 3 months and had never finished. They walked her to a side entrance. The guard held the door. She walked out into the sole night with a cardboard box and no car and no clear idea of where she was going, and the door closed behind her with a sound she would remember for a long time, very ordinary, very final, the sound of a building deciding it was done with her. She walked. She didn't have a destination. She just walked because stopping felt worse, and the box was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with what was inside it. The streets around Hansol were not empty, but they weren't crowded either. Late-night Seoul, the particular energy of a city that never entirely slept but had its rhythms. She walked past convenience stores and park delivery trucks, and a poang matcha with 2 men eating tteokbokki in silence, and she walked until her feet found the river without her entirely deciding to go there. The Han River at midnight was wide and dark, and indifferent in the best possible way. The city noise went quiet by degrees as she came down to the bank, and she sat on the concrete embankment with her box beside her and looked at the water and understood, with a clarity that surprised her by not being worse, that she had nothing. The career she'd spent a decade building, the city she'd allowed herself to love, the man she'd believed was different, all of it was gone, and it was not her fault. And that distinction, the fact that she had done nothing wrong, that the injustice was real and not imagined, turned out to matter very little when the result was the same. She pressed her palm flat against the concrete, cold. She pressed harder because the cold was real and she needed something to be real. She cried. She hadn't cried in an operating room. She hadn't cried in the conference room. She hadn't cried in the corridor outside the elevator or in the parking garage or walking out of the building. But here, alone beside the river, with the city light smearing on the water and no one to perform composure for, she cried. She cried until she was empty of it, and somewhere in the middle of being empty, she became aware that she was not alone. He was sitting a few feet away on the same embankment. She hadn't heard him arrive, hadn't sensed him, which was unusual enough that it registered even through everything else. He was still. Not the stillness of someone pretending not to notice, but something deeper. The stillness of a person entirely accustomed to his own company in the dark. She didn't look at him directly. She wiped her face with the back of her hand. He didn't speak. She didn't speak. A minute passed. Maybe 2. Then, without drama, without introduction, he removed the coat he was wearing. Heavy, dark, expensive, in the understated way of things that cost more than they announce, and leaned toward her and placed it across her shoulders. His face, when she finally looked at it, was difficult to read. Not young, not old. The kind of face that had been through something significant enough to make ordinary expressions redundant. His eyes were very dark and they were looking at the river, not at her. "You don't have to," she started. "I know," he said. She pulled the coat around her. It was warm in the way of something that had been worn by another body, and she was too exhausted to feel strange about it. They sat like that for another minute before she heard it. The low, smooth sound of an engine, and she turned to see a black sedan pulling up on the path behind them, joined by 2 more vehicles she could just make out in the dark. Not police vehicles, not taxis. The kind of vehicles that didn't advertise what they were. The man stood. He looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that made her feel, against all logic, that she was being recognized by someone who had been expecting her, which made no sense, which was completely irrational, and which she felt anyway. He held out his hand. Not to help her up. Something more deliberate than that. An offer she would have to decide whether to take. She looked at the cardboard box beside her. She looked at the river. She looked at the hand. The coat on her shoulders still carried the warmth of someone else's body. And she was very cold, and she was very tired, and she had nothing left to lose except the particular safety of not moving. She took his hand. He opened the door of the sedan. She got in. And as the door closed and the vehicle moved and the lights of the bridge appeared in the window ahead of her, she realized she did not know his name, did not know where she was going, and could not have explained, even to herself, even under pressure, why getting into a stranger's car in the middle of the night felt, for the first time in hours, like the only thing she'd done that made sense. The man settled into the seat beside her. The car was very quiet, very smooth. He looked straight ahead. "My name is Damien Co," he said. He said nothing else. Through the tinted glass, the river disappeared behind them. Somewhere in the city she was leaving, the news tickers still carried her name, and on the seat between her and the man who had just given her his coat, face down and half visible beneath the edge of his jacket, lay a photograph. She didn't reach for it, not yet, but the corner of it was visible, and the face in it was visible. And the face she saw there was a face she recognized from the wall of Hansol Medical Center's executive boardroom. The hospital chairman, silver-haired and formally suited, posed for whatever occasion required silver hair and formal suits. Standing beside him in the photograph was another man. She didn't know the second man, but she felt Damien Co's stillness change when her eyes moved to the photograph, the way a room changes temperature without anything visible moving. And she understood without being told that the photograph was not accidental, and that nothing about this night was accidental, and that she had just stepped into something that had been in motion for a very long time before she arrived. The sedan moved through the city. She held his coat closed around her and waited. The photograph stayed face down on the seat between them for 11 minutes. Avery counted because counting was something to do with her mind that wasn't falling apart. She watched the city move past the tinted glass, convenience stores, empty intersections, the occasional cab, and she counted the minutes, and she did not reach for the photograph, and she did not ask the question that was sitting in the middle of her chest like a stone. Damien Co did not look at her. He looked forward, or at his phone, or at nothing in particular. His posture was the posture of a man completely at rest in a moving vehicle in the middle of the night with a crying stranger beside him, which meant it was either completely natural or completely practiced, and she couldn't tell which. The convoy, 3 vehicles she'd confirmed, a lead SUV and a tail, moved through the Han River district and then north, into streets she didn't recognize. At the 11-minute mark, she picked up the photograph. He didn't react. She turned it over. 2 men. The hospital chairman, Director Lim Byung-chul, she knew his face from the framed portrait in the executive corridor, silver-haired and assembled into the particular shape of institutional authority. And a second man, younger, standing in what looked like a hotel lobby or a formal reception. The second man was laughing at something. He had Damien's jaw. Not similar. The same. She looked up. Damien was already watching her. She hadn't seen him turn. "Your father," she said. "Yes. He's with Director Lim. That photograph is from 15 years ago. He said it the way you stated facts that had long since burned through the part of you that felt things about them. 8 months before my father died." She set the photograph down carefully, face up this time. "How did he die?" "Officially, cardiac event. He was 51 and had no history of heart disease." He paused. "He was a pharmacologist. He had been consulting, quietly, for a government health oversight body. He'd found something in the procurement records of 3 major hospital networks. Price fixing at the surface. Deeper than that." Another pause. Shorter. "He called me 2 days before he died and told me he was going to take it to a prosecutor he trusted. I told him to be careful. He told me I worried too much." The car was very quiet. The heating system made a low sound. "What had he found?" Avery said. "We'll get to that." He reached over and took the photograph back, slid it into an interior pocket of his jacket. "First, tell me what happened in that operating room today." She stared at him. "Why?" "Because I need to know if you're useful or if I made a mistake picking you up." The bluntness of it hit her like a flat hand. She felt her jaw tighten. "You didn't pick me up. I got in the car." "You got in the car because I opened the door." He turned to look at her fully for the first time. Up close, his face was harder than it had seemed by the river. Not cruel, just worn in the specific way of someone who'd made decisions other people couldn't make and lived inside the consequences. "The operating room. Tell me." She told him. She kept it clinical because clinical was the only way she knew how to talk about it yet. The sequence of events, the anesthesia coverage change she hadn't been informed of, The resident in a chair that should have had a senior physician. The pressure drop. The crash. The 40 minutes that ended the wrong way. She told him about the 3 hours in the conference room. She told him about Julian. She did not cry again. She was done with that for tonight. When she finished, Damien was quiet for a moment. The resident covering anesthesia, he said. His name. Park. I don't know his first name. He's a second year, I think. He'll be gone by morning, transferred out or given cause for termination, whatever they find. How do you know that? Because he's a loose thread. And the people running Hansol Medical Center do not leave loose threads. She looked at him. Who are you? I told you my name. That's not what I asked. He considered this. Outside, the car had turned into a neighborhood she didn't recognize at all. Quieter, residential, the kind of street that didn't appear on tourist maps. The convoy slowed. I run several businesses, he said, legitimate ones, mostly, and I have access to information that other people have decided isn't supposed to exist. He said it without effect, the way someone else might say, I work in finance, or I'm between jobs. Director Lim Byung-chul has been on my list for 14 years. The problem was evidence, the kind that holds, the kind that can't be explained away or buried by a lawyer with the right connections. And I'm relevant to this how. You were inside that operating room. You saw the failure in real time. You understand the medical architecture of what they did. He looked at her. And they've already made you the public face of their cover story, which means you have a reason to want what I want. Which is everything they built, he said, reduced to nothing. The car stopped. The building they'd stopped in front of was unremarkable. 6 stories, older construction, the kind of residential block that existed in every city and registered on no one's radar. One of Damien's people opened her door. She got out. She still had the cardboard box. She carried it inside. The apartment on the 4th floor was larger than the exterior suggested and furnished in the manner of a place designed for function rather than comfort. Good equipment, clean surfaces, nothing personal anywhere. 3 people were already inside. 2 men, 1 woman, none of whom looked at Avery with anything except the neutral professional assessment of people deciding how much of a liability she was. Damien spoke to them in Korean, too fast for her to follow. The woman, late 30s, close-cropped hair, the compressed energy of someone who slept light and woke fast, answered him. He nodded. He turned to Avery. You can sleep. There's a room. We talk properly in the morning. I'm not going to sleep. You've been awake since before 6. You cried for 20 minutes beside a river. You're running on cortisol and anger, and in approximately 3 hours you'll be useless. He said it without unkindness, which made it worse. Sleep. She slept. She didn't mean to. She lay down in the room he'd indicated, still in her clothes, intending to think, and the thinking dissolved into nothing somewhere around the point where she heard muffled voices from the other room and decided to identify them. She woke at 5 a.m. to the smell of coffee. Real coffee. She lay still for a moment with the ceiling above her and let herself understand again, in the full light of conscious thought, exactly what had happened to her life. Then she got up. The main room was different in the early morning. Maps on the table, actual printed maps with markings. A laptop open to something she couldn't read from the doorway. Damien was at the table with the woman from last night and one of the men. The other man was gone. Nobody had slept, or if they had, it wasn't evident. The woman looked up when Avery entered. Something moved across her face, not hostility, more like the reassessment of an estimate. Damien poured coffee without being asked and pushed it across the table. Avery sat down. She drank. It was good. That seemed important to acknowledge to herself, that in the middle of everything the coffee was genuinely good. This is Yuna, Damien said. She handles intelligence. You can talk to her the same way you talk to me. Yuna nodded once, the nod of a person who communicated primarily in nods and silences. The man you called Park, Yuna said. Her English was precise and slightly formal. His full name is Park Jun-ho. He was transferred to a satellite clinic in Incheon at 4 this morning. His personnel file has been updated to reflect a voluntary reassignment request. Avery set down her cup. They moved him in the middle of the night. They moved him in the middle of the night, Una confirmed, which means they were prepared to move him. The reassignment paperwork was generated before the patient died. The coffee sat in Avery's stomach like a warm weight. She thought about that. So, paperwork generated before the death, before the crisis, before anyone needed a scapegoat. Not reactive, prepared. They were ready for something to go wrong, she said. They were ready, Damien said, because they made something go wrong. He turned the laptop toward her. The screen showed a procurement record, dense, formatted in the way of institutional documents, columns of line items and approval signatures. Her Korean was functional but not fast. She scanned it. Medication supplier changes 3 months prior. A switch from an established anesthesia supply chain to a new vendor she didn't recognize. The new vendor, Damien said, is a shell company registered in a name that doesn't connect to Hansol on paper. On paper, it connects to a pharmaceutical distribution network that operates across 7 countries. He let her look at it for another moment. My father found the first version of this network 15 years ago. Different names, same structure. Same people, she said. Some of them. The ones at the top. The ones who understand how to survive long enough to rebuild. Avery sat back. She was very awake now, the kind of awake that happened when your mind found something to grip. They compromised the medication supply, deliberately. Compromised is a gentle word. They introduced failure into the system and then positioned it so that when a patient died, not if when, there was already a narrative, a foreign doctor, insufficient oversight, a warning sign everyone could claim they noticed in retrospect. She heard herself saying it and felt, underneath the clarity, something that wanted to become rage if she let it. She didn't let it, not yet. How many times? Una and Damien exchanged a look. Park Yoon-soo is not the first, Una said. In the past 2 years, there have been 4 patient deaths at Hansol and its affiliated network hospitals that match this pattern. Supply chain anomalies that never made it into formal incident reports. Nursing staff transferred before they could be interviewed. Records amended post-mortem. 4 people. 4 that we can trace. Avery pressed her palm flat on the table surface. Same gesture she'd made on the concrete by the river. Cold. Real. She pressed until she felt the edge of the wood under her fingers. Why? Why kill patients? What is the financial mechanism? Damien reached into the folder beside the laptop and slid a single page across to her. Insurance fraud at the pharmaceutical level is part of it, but the larger mechanism is the transplant waiting list. You need to look at the transplant division. She looked at the page. Numbers. A waiting list. Organ procurement. She could read enough of the format to understand, with annotations in red. Names removed, replaced with codes. Her mind went to a place it didn't want to go, and went there anyway because that was the discipline, that was the training. You looked at the thing directly. They're manipulating the list, she said. Who gets moved up? Who waits? Who pays to move up? Damien said. And who is determined to be less valuable than the resources required to save them? The room was very quiet. From somewhere outside, she could hear a city beginning its morning. Distant traffic, a horn, the specific layered sound of soul coming awake. A city full of people who lived inside a healthcare system and trusted it the way people trusted infrastructure, the way you trusted that when you turned on the tap the water was safe, that the bridge would hold, that the hospital would try to save you. I want in, she said. Damien looked at her steadily. You understand what it means. You need medical expertise. You have intelligence, access, resources. I have 11 years of understanding exactly how these systems operate and where the bodies are hidden. She met his eyes. Literally. Una made a sound that was almost a laugh. Damien's expression didn't change, but something in it shifted. There are people who will come after you, he said. Not metaphorically. There is already a man whose job it is to manage problems that can't be managed through the legal system. His name is Choi. He's been working for the hospital chairman since before my father died. You've been after this for 15 years and you haven't been able to finish it. I've been building the case to finish it. I'm close. He paused. I was close before last night. You changed the calculation. How? Because you were inside that operating room. You're a named party in their cover story. Any evidence you can corroborate from the inside, but medication protocols, procurement records, patient files you personally accessed, carries a legal weight that my sources can't achieve. He looked at her very directly. And because you're angry enough to be useful, but trained enough not to be reckless. You don't know that about me. I've had 12 hours and 3 people who are very good at their jobs. He said it without apology. You have no history of impulsive decisions. You walked away from a stronger position in Chicago because you saw something institutional that troubled you and didn't want to be part of it. You've been at Hansol for 19 months without a single incident report filed against you until last night. He picked up his coffee. You're not reckless. You're careful and you're thorough, and you just had everything stripped away by people who calculated that you wouldn't have the resources to fight back. She held his gaze for a moment. They calculated wrong, she said. Yes, he said. They did. The next 6 days were the most intensely educational of her life, which was saying something for a woman who'd done 11 years of emergency medicine. Una walked her through the intelligence architecture, what they had, what they needed, the specific gaps that Avery's medical knowledge could fill. The pharmaceutical network operated through a layered system of legitimate and semi-legitimate entities, using real hospitals and real supply chains as cover for the manipulation of specific transactions at specific points. It was elegant in the way that only truly corrupt systems could be elegant, because they had the advantage of not needing to explain themselves to anyone. She learned the names. The chairman, Lim Byung-chul. The CFO, a man named Han who had transferred in from a financial sector background 8 years ago and had quietly restructured the hospital's procurement division within 6 months of arriving. A logistics coordinator named Shin, who managed the physical movement of materials through a network that extended, Damien had been right, well beyond Seoul. She learned the gaps. The transplant records were the core of it, the piece that most directly implicated murder rather than negligence. Those records were maintained on a separate server with access limited to 5 people, all of them executive level. On the 7th day, Una came in at 7 in the morning with a look on her face that Avery had not seen there before, controlled but tight around the edges. Your phone, Una said. I haven't used it, like you told me. Your old number, someone has been running location pings on it through the carrier network. She set a printed report on the table. Standard surveillance technique. It doesn't require access to the phone itself. But the pings are originating from a contractor service that Hansol uses for their security infrastructure. Avery looked at the report. They're looking for me. They're making sure you stayed gone, Damien said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in. There's a difference. If they just wanted to find you, they'd have other methods. They're checking that you haven't resurfaced, which means they're worried I might. Which means they know you have something that could matter if you decided to use it. I don't. Not yet. We haven't. They don't know what you have. They know what you might have seen. He came into the room fully. He was wearing the same dark jacket he seemed to always wear, and he looked like he hadn't slept again, and there was something in his posture that was different from the previous days. Coiled, she thought, the way a person moved when something had changed. Una. Una turned to the laptop. Opened something, turned it toward Avery. Newsfeed, recent. She read it, and her stomach dropped. The headline was about Julian. Dr. Julian Kwan, named as a key witness in the Hansol patient death investigation, had given a formal statement to the hospital ethics board. The statement, according to the article, included testimony about concerning behavior by the foreign physician in the lead-up to the surgery, a pattern of insubordination, disregard for protocol, possible impairment. Possible impairment. She read it twice. The rage arrived this time without her permission, a clean, bright, uncomplicated fury that had nowhere to go except inward, where it compressed itself into something cold. He's building the story, she said. He's not just covering himself, he's making it worse. Yes, Damien said, because he's scared. She looked up. He knows enough about what they did to be a liability. So he's making himself an asset. The more useful he is to their narrative, the safer he is. Damien looked at her with something that might have been respect if it had been less restrained. Yes. She pushed back from the table and stood. walked to the window. The view from this apartment was of a narrow street and the back of another building, nothing significant. She looked at it anyway. Julian had known. He'd told her himself. He'd known about the cost-cutting decisions, the procurement failures, the memos. He'd known, and he'd watched, and he'd made his calculation. And now he was doing it again, more deliberately, with more at stake. She thought about Minna, the daughter, 31 years old and good at hiding fear, sitting in that waiting room while her father died on a table above her. She thought about the 4 other names on Yuna's list, the people in the 4 other cases that matched the pattern. She thought about the transplant waiting list and the codes where names should be. She turned back from the window. "I need access to the hospital's internal system," she said. "My login was suspended, but the suspension came from administration, not IT. If the IT revocation hasn't been processed, and based on what you've told me about how this organization moves, there's a lag between administrative decisions and system implementation. My credentials may still function for another day or 2. Yuna looked at Damien. Damien looked at Avery. "What would you access?" "The transplant records, not the executive server. I never had access to that, and trying to force it would trigger alerts. But the ancillary records. Procurement orders associated with specific patient cases. Medication administration logs. Things that cross-reference." She held his gaze. "I can build you a bridge between what you have and what you need. If they see your credentials active in the system, they'll know I'm not gone," she said it steadily, "which means we'd need to move faster after that." Damien was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then he said something to Yuna in Korean. Yuna's hands went to the keyboard. Avery's old login was still active. Yuna found this in under 4 minutes, using a query method that Avery didn't fully understand and didn't ask about because there were things in this apartment she'd made a decision not to press on. The administrative suspension had flagged her account. The IT deactivation order, generated 48 hours later, was scheduled to run at the end of the current billing cycle, 4 days away. 4 days. "We'd need to access through a masked connection," Yuna said. "Route it so the originating IP doesn't point here or anywhere associated with Damien's network." She was already typing. "I can do that. But if they have a live monitoring alert on her specific credentials, which they may have added after generating the suspension, the login itself triggers notification regardless of origin." "Can you check for the alert before logging in?" Avery said. "Checking for the alert would require a preliminary query that itself might register." "How fast can you pull what we need if we go in?" "Depends what we're pulling." "Procurement cross-references, specific patient cases. I know the file structure. I can navigate it faster than anyone else in this room." Yuna looked at Damien. Damien looked at Avery. "If they see the login," he said, "we lose the window. They deactivate your credentials, probably add additional security to the whole record system, and we're back to the external approach, which takes months." "I know." "Months we may not have." "I know that too." He held her gaze for a moment. Something passed through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not doubt, not quite trust either. Something between them. Something that had been built in 7 days of working in close quarters with someone who matched your pace. And she was aware of it, and she thought he was aware of it, and neither of them did anything with it because there was no room for it right now, and they both understood that. "Do it," he said. Yuna's hands moved across the keyboard. The mask connection assembled itself in stages she narrated quietly. Avery pulled a chair beside her and leaned in. The login screen appeared. Hansol Medical Center Internal Network. The logo she'd looked at every day for 19 months. Avery typed her credentials. The screen processed for 4 seconds. Then it opened. She went directly to the procurement module. Her hands moved fast. Yuna tracked beside her, copying file paths, flagging records, moving data to a secure external location with a speed that spoke to a great deal of practice. Avery cross-referenced patient case numbers against medication order records, found the anomalies she was looking for, the vendor codes that didn't match the established supply chain, the authorization signatures that came from mid-level administrators rather than the medical directors who should have signed off. She was 7 minutes in when Yuna said quietly, "Alert fired." Avery kept moving. "How long?" "Before they respond to it?" "Unknown. Could be automated, could require a human to action it. Best case, 15 minutes. Worst case, already happened, Avery said. Keep copying. She moved to the transplant-adjacent records. Not the executive files, those were behind a separate wall she couldn't touch, but the scheduling records, the preoperative assessments, the cases that had been expedited versus delayed. She knew what she was looking for because she'd spent 7 days learning the shape of it, and the shape of it was visible once you knew how to see it. It was there. Not a smoking gun, nothing so simple, but a pattern. Specific case numbers, specific timestamps, specific authorization codes that appeared in both the scheduling anomalies and the procurement records she'd already pulled. A thread connecting the manipulation of who got treated and when to the financial infrastructure that made the manipulation profitable. I have it, she said. Copying, Una said. How much longer? 90 seconds. Avery held position. She watched the progress bar. She was aware of her own breathing in the way you became aware of it when you were trying to stay calm. At the 60-second mark, the session terminated. Not a timeout. A forced termination. Different error code, different response behavior. Someone had seen the alert and acted on it. She stared at the login screen that had replaced her session. Did we get it? She said. Una's eyes were on the external drive indicator. It stopped blinking. She checked the file count, ran a quick verification. 93%, she said. What's in the missing 7? The last set of scheduling records I was copying, the most recent 12 months. Avery sat back. 93%. She ran the calculation in her head. What they had, what it could prove, what the gap might mean in a legal context. Whether the thread was still visible without the last 12 months of data. It was. Barely. But it was. Okay, she said. Okay, Una said. She looked across at Damien, who had been standing behind them for the last 10 minutes. They know she's active. Damien nodded slowly. His face had the particular stillness of a person reorganizing timelines in real time. How long before they determine we accessed from outside their network? They already know the session was masked. That alone tells them what they need to know. Then we assume Troy is active by morning. He looked at Avery, which means this location is compromised as of tonight. We move. Avery looked at the black screen where her access to Hansol's network had been 60 seconds ago, and understood that she had just made the choice that ended the possibility of any version of this where she stayed quiet, stayed invisible, waited to see if time resolved things. She had crossed from passive to active. She had lit the signal fire. They knew she was still here. They knew she had been looking. And somewhere in the city, in an office, or in a car, or in a building, she had no way to identify. A man named Choi was receiving a notification and making a call. Her phone, the new one Una had given her, the untraceable one, buzzed on the table. She looked at it. Unknown number. She looked at Damien. He nodded. She answered. The voice on the other end was Julian's. Avery. He sounded like a man who had not slept and had been doing math all night and had arrived at an answer he didn't like. I need to see you. Not for them. For me. There's something I didn't tell you and His voice dropped. I think they're going to kill me. The words landed flat in the quiet of the apartment. Avery held the phone against her ear and looked at the wall and breathed. Where are you? She said. My car. The parking structure near Hansol, level 3. His voice had the quality of something barely held together. Not performance. She had heard Julian perform composure for 19 months and knew the texture of it. This was different. This was a man who had done his accounting and didn't like the sum. I've been sitting here for 2 hours. I didn't know who else to call. Why me? Because you're the only person left who has a reason to care whether I'm alive. A pause. And because I know things that... Avery, the medication wasn't an accident. I have documentation. I've had it for 3 weeks. Her hand tightened on the phone. 3 weeks, she said. I was trying to find a way out that didn't. You had documentation for 3 weeks and a patient died and you stood in front of cameras and confirmed every lie they told about me. She kept her voice level. The effort of keeping it level was significant. And now you want to meet. I'm scared. Good, she said. Don't move, I'll call you back. She hung up. She looked at Damien. He had heard enough. His face told her nothing, which by now she'd learned meant he was moving fast inside. It could be a setup, Una said immediately. They know we accessed the network. They know you're active. Using him to locate you is the obvious next step. It's also possible he's telling the truth about the documentation, Avery said. Those aren't mutually exclusive, Damien said. I know. She set the phone on the table. If the documentation exists and he has it, we need it. If it's a setup, going in blind gets us killed. But if we don't go and he actually does have something that fills the gap in what we pulled tonight. She stopped, looked at Damien. The 12 months we missed, the most recent records, if his documentation overlaps with that gap. Damien was quiet for 4 seconds. She'd learned to count his silences. 4 seconds meant he'd already worked it through and was deciding whether to tell her the answer or let her arrive at it. We don't go to him, he said. We bring him here. If he moves from that parking structure before we verify the route is clean, we don't meet. If he insists on a different location, we don't meet. He looked at Una. Put someone on the structure. I want to know if there's coverage already in place. Una was already on her phone. 40 minutes later, Julian Kwan walked through the door of the apartment on the 4th floor, looking like a man who had aged 8 years since Avery had last seen him in the hospital conference room. He was still wearing his work clothes. He'd come directly from the hospital, apparently, or had been in his car since leaving it. His jacket was wrinkled in the specific way of fabric that had been slept in, though she doubted he'd slept. He stopped when he saw Damien. Who is this? He said. Someone you don't need to know about right now, Avery said. Sit down. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not the controlled confidence, not the careful warmth, not the managed guilt from the conference room. Something stripped down, raw in the way of a wound that had been covered too long. I didn't know they were going to use you the way they did, he said. I want you to know that. I don't care what you want me to know, Julian. I care about the documentation. Do you have it? He reached into his jacket, an envelope. She took it before he could offer it and moved to the table and opened it. Printed records, pharmaceutical orders, signed authorizations, not the mid-level administrator signatures she'd found in the system, but executive signatures. Han, the CFO, and one she hadn't seen before, on 2 of the documents, a signature belonging to the head of the transplant division. And beneath those, something else. A memo. Internal, dated 11 weeks ago, addressed to Director Lim, authored by Han. She read it once, fast, then again slowly. The memo outlined a strategy. Not procurement, not billing. A strategy for accelerating the transplant waiting list. Manipulation to a new target. International patients, high net worth individuals located outside Korea, willing to pay for prioritized access. The infrastructure was in place. The risk assessment was attached. The risk assessment included, in the language of bureaucratic abstraction, a section on the management of domestic patients displaced by the acceleration. Management of domestic patients displaced by the acceleration. She set the memo down. The people who got moved down the list to make room, she said. What happened to them? Julian was looking at his hands. Some of them found access through other hospitals. Some of them... He stopped. Julian. Some of them died while waiting. He said it quietly to the floor. 4 confirmed, possibly more. The documentation of cause of death was managed separately, different department. I don't have access to those files. The room was very quiet. You've known this for 3 weeks, Damien said. It was the first time he'd spoken since Julian arrived, and the quality of his voice, flat, precise, carrying no particular emotion, made Julian look up sharply. I found the memo by accident. I was reviewing a budget discrepancy. It was misfiled. You found it 3 weeks ago and you made a calculation, Damien said. You decided the risk to yourself was higher than the cost of knowing and doing nothing. Julian's jaw tightened. It's more complicated than 4 people died waiting for organs while their spots were sold to foreign nationals. It is not complicated. Damien looked at him the way you looked at something you had already fully assessed and had no further questions about. Why are you scared now? Specifically, what changed tonight? Julian looked at Avery. She looked back at him and gave him nothing. He exhaled. My login was flagged. Hospital security contacted me at 9 p.m. They told me there had been unauthorized access to the internal network and that my credentials were among those queried during the intrusion. He paused. I didn't access anything. I've been careful, but someone used an approach that pulled my access records as part of a broader sweep, and now Lim's office knows I've been accessed in the same event as... He stopped. Avery looked at Una. Una's expression was very controlled. The sweep that copied your credentials during the access event, she said carefully, was a byproduct of the masked connection routing. When we entered through the network layer, the query pattern we used would have flagged several active credentials as part of its navigation. It's a fingerprint artifact. You flagged him, Avery said. We flagged him incidentally. It wasn't targeted. But Lim doesn't know that. She turned back to Julian. They think you were part of it. They think you helped us get in. Which means, Damien said, he is no longer useful to their narrative. He's a liability. Julian's face had gone a color that wasn't good. I didn't help anyone. I've been loyal. I've done everything they asked. Stop talking about loyalty, Avery said. The word came out of her with more force than she'd intended, and she let it. You don't know what that word means in this context. Those 4 people on the transplant list were loyal patients. They trusted the system. They waited where they were told to wait, and they died waiting. She stood up. Give Una everything you have. Every file, every record, every copy of anything you've held on to. Then you don't move from this apartment until we tell you to. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his face, an attempt at the old dynamic, the familiar arrangement of authority between them. And she watched it fail and collapse. He nodded. He sat down. Una took the documents and began scanning them within minutes. Avery walked to the window and looked out at the narrow street below and tried to organize what had just changed. The documentation filled the gap. Not completely. Nothing was ever complete, but enough. The thread was now visible from procurement to executive authorization to the waiting list, manipulation to the memo to the financial mechanism. Enough to take to investigators, in a country where the right investigators could act on it, if those investigators existed and could be reached before Choi found them. The question of Choi had not left her mind since Damien first said the name. She'd asked in the first 3 days and received a brief and carefully insufficient answer. A man who handled problems. She hadn't pressed because she'd had enough to learn without pressing. Now she thought she should have pressed earlier. She turned from the window. Damien was across the room, on his phone, speaking too quietly to hear. She watched him for a moment. The tension in his back, the way his free hand had closed and then opened again at his side. He ended the call. He didn't come to her immediately. He stood where he was for a moment. She'd learned that when he did that, it was because he was deciding how to say something. We need to move tonight, he said. Not tomorrow morning, now. What happened? My contact at the Port Authority. She handles cargo records. She's been tracking the pharmaceutical network's logistics for me for 8 months. He paused. She stopped responding 40 minutes ago. Her husband just called her phone looking for her. She left work 3 hours ago and hasn't come home. The cold settled into Avery's chest again. Familiar now. She recognized it as the feeling of consequences arriving. Choi, she said. Probably. He was already moving. Una. What do we need? What do we leave? The apartment dissolved into coordinated motion. Una copied files to 2 separate drives, destroyed 3 devices with a speed and method that suggested she'd done this before, packaged the documentation into a case she hadn't opened since they arrived. The 2 men from the first night appeared. She still didn't know their names and understood she wasn't going to be given them, and began their own preparations. Julian sat in the middle of it all, looking like a man watching a storm from inside a house he just realized wasn't built for weather. They were in vehicles in 18 minutes. The new location was 40 minutes south of the city, a property that Avery gathered was one of several Damien maintained for exactly this kind of transition. She didn't ask how many properties or how many transitions. She sat in the back of the vehicle with the document case between her feet and watched the city give way to the particular dark of the highway corridor, and thought about the Port Authority contact, a woman she'd never met, a woman who had been doing something small and dangerous for 8 months out of loyalty or money or belief or all three, and felt the weight of it. They arrived at a low structure surrounded by trees. Inside, clean, functional. No windows on the ground floor. She noted that without deciding what to feel about it, the next 12 hours were work. She and Una went through everything. The records she'd pulled from the network, Julian's documents, the cross-references between them. They built the structure of it, laid it out on paper because screens felt insufficient for something that needed to be held and seen. The pharmaceutical network, the procurement fraud, the transplant manipulation, the deaths, the dead on the operating table and the dead on the waiting list, and somewhere at the edge of it, the death of a pharmacologist 15 years ago, who had found the first version of all of this and had been silenced before he could carry it forward. Julian sat in a corner and answered questions when they had them, and otherwise said nothing. He had achieved a specific kind of stillness that she recognized as the stillness of a person who had finished lying to themselves and was in the process of understanding what that meant. She didn't feel sorry for him. She didn't feel anything about him that was as simple as hate. What she felt was closer to exhaustion on his behalf. The exhaustion of watching someone spend years building a structure of self-justification and then watching it come down in a single night. At 3 a.m, Una fell asleep at the table. Avery sat alone with the documents for a while. Then Damien came in with coffee and sat across from her. They didn't speak immediately. The coffee was instant, from a shelf, not the good kind. She drank it anyway. "Your contact," she said. "The Port Authority woman." "Her name is Lee Soo-jin." He said it without hesitation. 44, 2 children. She worked cargo documentation for 11 years. I recruited her because she had access and because she was angry about something she'd seen and hadn't been able to do anything with. He looked at the table. "I don't know yet if she's dead or if they've taken her for questioning. Neither outcome is acceptable." "How many people have you put at risk in 15 years? He looked at her directly. "Fewer than I might have. More than I wanted." She held his gaze. "And if this doesn't work, if we can't get this to someone who can act on it, and Choi finds us, and it ends here, then it doesn't end here. My legal team has standing instructions. If I stop communicating, the documentation goes to 4 different destinations simultaneously. 2 international investigative bodies, 1 domestic prosecutor I've been cultivating for 6 years, and a journalist at a foreign news bureau who I've verified is clean. You've had a dead man switch the whole time. Since the beginning. Then why haven't you used it? Why not trigger it now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because without a living witness who can testify to the medical specifics, the documentation alone creates a scandal. Careers end, fines are paid, the organization restructures, and the people at the top find other structures to operate inside." He looked at her. "I have spent 15 years building the case that puts them in a room with no exit. Not a scandal, not a restructuring. A room with no exit." He picked up his coffee. "That requires more than paper. It requires us. It requires us." She thought about that for a moment. About the particular math of it, what they had, what they needed, how far they still had to go. About Lee Soo-jin, 44, 2 children, who might be in a room with no windows right now because she'd made the choice to help. She was about to say something else when the phone on the table, the secure line, the one that almost never rang, activated. Una woke instantly. She was at the table in seconds, a fact that told Avery she hadn't been fully asleep. She looked at the incoming identifier on the screen and her face did the thing it had done before, tight, controlled, not quite right. She answered, listened, said 3 words in Korean, hung up. She looked at Damien. "The prosecutor," she said. "The one you've been cultivating for 6 years." Damien set down his coffee. "Kim. His office was searched tonight. Government authority, anti-corruption task force. His case files were seized." She paused. "He's been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The charge is undisclosed, but the person who called me says it's framed as misconduct." Damien's face did not change. Avery watched it not change and understood for the first time exactly how much control that required. They're ahead of us, she said. They've been ahead of us. He said it without drama. What this tells me is that the documentation we pulled from Hansel's network triggered more than a security alert. It told them how close we are, and they've started collapsing the exits. He stood. Kim was one of the 3 people I trusted to receive the dead man's documentation and act on it. Now, he's compromised. Which leaves 2, Una said. Which leaves the international bodies and the journalist. He looked at Avery. The international route takes time. Due process, jurisdictional questions, the particular slowness of institutional bodies that can't be pressured. He paused. The journalist can move faster, but publication without institutional backing gives them room to discredit, to frame it as fabricated, as a foreign interference narrative, as a disgruntled foreign doctor, Avery said, who manufactured evidence after losing her license. Yes. She looked at the table, at the documents, at the architecture of what they'd built, and the structure that was forming around it. Not an exit route, but a narrowing, a tightening of available space. She thought about what Damien had said in the car, that first night. Do you want the truth or revenge? She had not answered it then because she hadn't known the answer. She thought she might know it now, and it wasn't the answer she would have given in her previous life. Before the operating room, before the conference room, before the river. The transplant division head, she said. The signature on 2 of Julian's documents. Who is he? Dr. Cha Min-seok. He's been running the transplant division for 9 years. He signed off on the waiting list manipulation. His name is directly on the authorization. She looked up. He's also the only person in the chain who isn't pure administration. He's a doctor, which means he's subject to a different set of professional obligations, a different regulatory body, a different... She stopped, looked at Damien. If he could be reached, not through a prosecutor, not through a journalist. If someone could get him in a room and he could be made to understand that the exits are closing for him too, he'd need a reason to believe that, Damien said. We give him one. She spread her hands over the documents. We have the procurement records, we have the memo, we have the authorization signatures. We can show him exactly what he signed and exactly what it means in terms of his personal criminal exposure. And we can show him that the people he signed it for are already starting to manage their own exposure, which means managing theirs by managing his. Damien looked at her for a long moment. You want to offer him a way out. I want to give him accurate information and let him make a choice. She met his eyes. Which is more than anyone gave the people on that waiting list. Julian, from his corner, spoke for the first time in 2 hours. Cha won't talk, he said. I know him. He's been with Lim for 9 years. He's protected. He was protected, Avery said, before tonight. She didn't look at Julian. Everything changes when the people protecting you start protecting themselves. The room was quiet. Then Damien said, Getting to Cha requires access. He'll have personal security. Lim will have made sure of that after the network breach. Getting him in a room means getting through that security, which means we need to know his movements, his schedule, The door opened. One of the 2 men she didn't know the names of. He came to Damien and said something in Korean, very low. Damien's expression shifted fractionally. He looked at Avery. There's a vehicle on the road that leads to this property, he said. It's been stationary for 11 minutes, no lights. The room reorganized itself in her understanding. The warmth went out of the air. How did they find us? She said. Damien looked at Julian. Julian looked back. His face went through 3 things in quick succession: denial, understanding, and a final settling that was almost resignation. I told you I came straight from the parking structure, he said. I told you that. But, Damien said. But before I called Avery, I called someone else. Julian's voice had gone very flat. The flatness of a man who had just arrived, finally, at the bottom of all his calculations and found nothing there. I called someone I trusted. I told him where I was going. I didn't give him the address, but I told him I was going to meet Avery and that I was leaving the city. He stopped. I thought he could help. I've known him for 6 years. Who? Avery said. His name is Park Woon-jin. He's a senior administrator at Hansol. I thought... He's Choi's eyes inside the hospital, Yuna said. She was already moving, gathering the drives, the case. He's been on our list for 4 months. Avery stood very still in the middle of the room and felt the shape of it close around her. Julian had called someone. The someone had called Choi. Choi had tracked the direction Julian had traveled, not the exact address, because he would have arrived faster if he had the exact address, and was now sitting on the road outside in the dark, working his way toward the specific. 11 minutes stationary. Working toward the specific was already done. She looked at Damien. He was looking at her too, with an expression that was the most exposed she'd seen on him. Not fear, but something adjacent to it. The face of a man who had run 15 years of controlled operation and was now in a room where the control was someone else's. "We go out the back," he said. "Now. Everything we can carry." "The documents," she said. "Yuna has the drives. Leave the paper." "There are originals in that stack, Julian's documents. Leave them." He was already moving. "We go." She grabbed two things. The drives Yuna pressed into her hand, and Julian's envelope. The original memo, the authorization signatures. She put it inside her jacket. She followed Damien toward the back of the structure. Behind her, she heard Julian stand. Heard him follow. She didn't look back to check. She didn't have the bandwidth for it. The back of the structure opened onto a sloped terrain, dark. The trees thick enough that the first 20 meters would provide cover. Damien's people moved without flashlights. She kept pace by sound and by the specific gravity of keeping up with someone who knew where they were going. They were 40 meters into the trees when she heard the vehicles from the front of the structure. Not one, multiple, moving fast, no longer pretending to be stationary. Doors, voices, sharp and directive. She didn't hear the words because she was moving and the trees absorbed sound, and she was focused on her footing and on breathing and on not being the reason the pace slowed. Damien stopped at a vehicle hidden under tree cover. Another car, she had no idea when it had been placed here or by whom, and they loaded in without speaking. The engine started quiet. The lights stayed off. She sat in the back with Julian beside her and Yuna on her other side, and the envelope of documents pressed against her ribs, and listened to the sound of a separate vehicle somewhere through the trees responding to what was happening at the structure. They had the evidence. They had lost a safe position, a trusted prosecutor, a field contact who might be dead, and the only version of this plan that had felt like it had forward motion. Julian, beside her, was breathing in short increments that she recognized as the breathing of a person managing panic by counting. She reached into her jacket, touched the edge of the envelope. The authorization signature, the memo, the documentation of what had been done and who had decided to do it. Real paper. She could feel the edge of it. She pulled her hand out of her jacket and looked at the dark moving past the window and tried to think about what happened next. And for the first time since the river, she found that she genuinely did not. The vehicle moved through the dark without lights for 6 minutes before Damien said anything. "The journalist?" he said. "Her name is Rachel Yoon. She works for an international wire service with a Seoul bureau. I've been holding her as the last option because publication without institutional support gives them room to attack the source." He paused. "We no longer have the luxury of better options." Yuna was already on the secure phone. "I'll reach out. Tell her we have documentation, medical testimony, and a direct witness to executive authorization. Tell her we need 48 hours to get her everything in a form she can verify independently." He looked at the road. "Tell her we need to meet tonight." Avery watched the dark outside the window and thought about 48 hours. About what 48 hours meant when Choi was already mobile and the prosecutor was compromised and Lee Soo-jin hadn't come home to her children. She thought about Dr. Cha Min-seok and his signature on those 2 documents and the 9 years he'd spent inside the machine. She thought about Park Yoon-soo's daughter, Min-ah, 31, who'd sat in a waiting room while the people above her made calculations about her father's life. She pressed the envelope harder against her ribs and breathed. "I want to reach Cha," she said. "Before we go to the journalist, I want one conversation with him." Damien looked at her. In the dark of the vehicle, his face was mostly shadow. "We have maybe 12 hours before Choi reestablishes our location," he said. "Using any of those hours on a man who might not break." "He'll break," she said. "Because he signed those documents as a doctor, not as an administrator, and that means the medical board has direct jurisdiction over him regardless of what Lim's lawyers can do. He knows that." And he knows that if this comes down and he's positioned as an architect rather than a witness, the medical board is the least of his problems. She held Damien's gaze. 1 hour. Give me 1 hour with him, and I'll give you a witness who can speak to the transplant manipulation from inside the executive structure. The vehicle was quiet for a moment. I know where he lives, Una said. Damien looked at the road ahead. His jaw worked once. 1 hour, he said. We move before dawn regardless. It was 4:40 a.m. when they stopped on a residential street in a neighborhood that said old money in the specific language of wide lots and walls with no gaps. Una had a home address, a vehicle registration, and 11 minutes of background on Cha Min-seok's household security setup that she delivered in a low voice while Damien's people confirmed the perimeter. No external guards, a security system on the house itself, camera coverage at the gate and front entrance. A man who had operated for 9 years under institutional protection and had perhaps not fully updated his personal security to account for institutional protection becoming a liability. Avery stood on the sidewalk in the cold before dawn and felt the particular clarity that came from being past a certain threshold of exhaustion. Not the useful clarity of rest, but the brutal clarity of having burned through everything soft and arriving at what was underneath. I go in alone, she said. Damien looked at her. He sees you, she said, and he calls security. He sees men he doesn't know and he calls security. He sees me, a doctor he's heard of, whose face has been on the news, who is supposed to be destroyed and gone, and he's curious enough to be afraid. She met Damien's eyes. Fear is the door. I need him afraid before I need him cooperative. A long moment. 2 of my people are on the back of the property, he said. If anything changes, you get to a window and you stay visible. She nodded. She walked to the gate. The intercom took 40 seconds to produce a voice. Groggy, irritated. The voice of a man who slept well and resented interruption. She put her face in front of the camera. Silence. Then, you need to leave. I'm calling. Dr. Cha. She kept her voice even and clear. I have the memo. Han's memo to Director Lim, dated 11 weeks ago. I have your signature on the authorization documents. I have the cross-referenced procurement records that connect those authorizations to 4 patient deaths on the transplant waiting list. She paused. I also have a very specific understanding of what the medical board does to physicians who signed off on the deliberate manipulation of organ allocation for profit. Another pause. You have 30 seconds to open this gate before I walk away and you find out what it looks like when I give everything I have to Rachel Yoon at the International Wire Bureau without your testimony in the record. Silence. 20 seconds of it. The gate clicked open. Cha Min-seok, in person, was smaller than his institutional portrait suggested. A compact man in his mid-50s, silver at his temples, wearing the particular expression of someone who had made one significant mistake very early in the morning. He stood in his own living room in a bathrobe and looked at Avery with the eyes of a man doing rapid structural assessment, calculating exits, weighing scenarios, arriving at the same place he'd been arriving at, she suspected, for the past several days. You shouldn't be here, he said. I know. She sat down without being invited. Sit down, Dr. Cha. This is going to take less time than you think. He sat. She laid Julian's envelope on the table between them, did not open it, left it there as an object. How many patients were moved down the list in the past 2 years, she said. He looked at the envelope. I want a lawyer. You'll have one. This conversation determines whether you need a defense lawyer or whether you get to be the person who called the prosecution. She held his gaze. How many? His hands on his knees tightened. I didn't know what the downstream. I was told the wait time adjustments were within. How many, Dr. Cha? A breath. 31 cases adjusted over 18 months. 4 confirmed deaths during extended wait periods. He said it like a man reading from a document he'd memorized against his will. 2 additional deaths that I flagged internally as potentially connected. The flag was removed from my report by Han's office. Avery kept her face neutral. 31. She had the number now. She needed the mechanism. The authorization you signed. Did you understand what you were signing? I was told it was a priority access protocol for international medical tourism, that it was... There are legal frameworks for the memo outlines explicit displacement of domestic patients for revenue generation. Your signature is below Hans, below the section that uses the phrase management of displaced cases. She leaned forward slightly. Did you read it before you signed? The silence that followed told her more than the answer would have. Yes, he said finally, very quietly. Then you knew. He looked at his hands. Outside, the first birds were beginning, the specific sound of early morning in a neighborhood where people slept without much fear. Director Lim has been the most powerful figure in Korean private healthcare for 20 years, Cha said. When he asks you to sign something, you sign it or you're gone. Not just from Hansel, from the field. He looked up. You're American. You don't understand what that means here. I understand what it means to make the easier choice, Avery said. She kept any particular inflection out of it. I understand it very well. She picked up the envelope. Here is what's going to happen. I'm going to give everything I have to Rachel Yoon within the next 12 hours. It publishes internationally. Domestically, it creates a response from the medical board, from prosecutors, from government oversight bodies that can no longer ignore it because it's already public and it's already international. She held his gaze. In that version, your signature is on documents in a published investigation with no explanatory context, no testimony establishing that you flagged concerns internally, no record of cooperation. She paused. In the other version, you call the medical board's emergency ethics line, which I have programmed into this phone, and you give a voluntary statement before the story breaks, which positions you as a cooperating witness, which is the only category of person in this situation that gets to keep practicing medicine. Cha stared at the phone she'd set on the table beside the envelope. Lim will know, he said. The moment I make that call, Lim is already managing his own exposure. He compromised a prosecutor last night. He sent a team to a location where I was staying. He's not thinking about protecting you right now. She looked at him levelly. You are already on your own, Dr. Cha. You've been on your own since the moment they realized how close the investigation was. The only question is which direction you fall. He looked at the phone for a long time. Then he picked it up. She was back at the vehicle in 42 minutes. Julian was still inside, looking like a man who had run out of things to feel. Damien was outside the vehicle, standing in the cold, and he read her face before she said anything. He's making the call, she said. Something moved through Damien's expression. Controlled, but real. She'd learned to see the real things underneath the control, in the past 8 days, the way you learn to read low light. Then we go to Yoon, he said. Rachel Yoon was 38, Korean-American, had been working the Seoul Bureau for 6 years, and she opened the door of her apartment at 6 a.m. looking like someone who had been awake for a while and had been waiting for something she wasn't sure was coming. She looked at Avery. She looked at Damien. She looked at the document case. Come in, she said. They spent 3 hours with her. Avery walked her through the medical architecture, the procurement fraud, the anesthesia coverage failure, the operating room, the waiting list mechanism, the deaths. Yuna laid out the document trail with the precision of someone who had organized this story in her mind for a long time and was finally allowed to tell it. Damien provided the 15-year context, his father, the original network, the structure that had survived and rebuilt and expanded while he gathered the proof to end it. Rachel asked hard questions. She challenged document provenance, chain of custody, the credibility of a disgraced physician as a primary source. Avery answered every challenge with the same flat precision she used in the operating room. Not defensively, not emotionally, just accurately, because accuracy was the only currency that mattered in this room. At the 2-hour mark, Rachel's expression had shifted from journalistic skepticism to something quieter and more focused. At the 3-hour mark, she asked one final question. If this publishes today, she said, looking at Damien, what happens to you? Damien looked at her calmly. That depends entirely on what happens to them first. Rachel looked at Avery. And you. You understand that the moment this goes live, you're the face of this story. Not as the accused, as the source. They'll come after your credibility, your history, every decision you've made in 11 years of practice. I know, Avery said. You're sure? I've been sure since I got into a car with a stranger at midnight. She held Rachel's gaze. Publish it. Rachel Yoon published the first installment at 2:17 p.m. Avery knew the exact time because she was watching the wire service feed on Yuna's laptop from the back of a vehicle moving through the city, and the moment the article appeared, she felt something shift in her body. A physical thing, a kind of pressure releasing and simultaneously a new and different pressure arriving, because what came after publication was not safety, but a different kind of exposure. The story moved fast. Within an hour, it had been picked up by 2 major domestic outlets and 1 international broadcaster. Within 2 hours, the Hansol Medical Center had issued a statement that described the reporting as defamatory and the sources as discredited. The statement was quoted within 40 minutes by 3 different journalists pointing out that it failed to address any of the specific documented claims. Cha's voluntary statement to the medical board had been logged at 7:23 a.m. That information came through Yuna's contact at the board. It had not yet become public, but it would, and Damien said it would probably become public before the end of the day. Director Lim Byung-chul gave no statement. Choi gave no statement because Choi did not exist in any publicly acknowledged capacity. The message came through on the secure phone at 4:45 p.m., and even now Avery didn't know precisely how it was routed or who had routed it, because the message appeared as a text on Yuna's device, and Yuna's face, when she read it, was a face emptied of everything except a specific, urgent attention. Lee Soo-jin, Yuna said. She's alive. She's at a private clinic in Suwon. She was held for questioning and released 4 hours ago. A breath. She's with her family. Damien, who had been still for the past 20 minutes, closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Avery looked at him in those 2 seconds and saw something she'd only glimpsed before. What the 15 years looked like from the inside. What it cost. The specific face of a person who had lived with the weight of other people's consequences and had found, in one small moment, that one of those consequences had not become the worst thing. Then he opened his eyes, and he was the same man again. It's not over, he said. I know, she said. It wasn't over because Choi was still moving, because Lim had resources that didn't require institutional cover to deploy, because the story had broken, but breaking the story and ending the network were not the same event, and in the space between them there were still people who had reason to ensure this particular narrative never reached its conclusion. The warning came at 6:30 p.m. as they were relocating again. Damien's operational rhythm was relocation every few hours now, a tempo she'd adapted to with the grim practicality of someone who had stopped expecting stability. And it came from an unexpected source. Julian, sitting beside her in the vehicle, said, "They're going to hit the journalist." Damien turned from the front seat. Julian looked at his hands. He'd been looking at his hands a great deal in the past 24 hours. Park Woon-jin, the man I called. He told me something in the parking structure the night I came to you. He stopped. He told me that if the story ever got out, the protocol was to discredit the sources and neutralize the primary publisher. He meant buying the story, pressuring editors, the standard mechanism. His jaw moved. But after the breach, and after Choi was activated, that protocol would have escalated. Neutralize, Avery said flatly. He used that word. Damien was already on the phone. The vehicle had stopped. Outside, she could see they were near the river again. Different section, south of the bridge, the light going copper in the late afternoon. The Han River finding her again, the way significant locations in a life tended to reappear. She heard Damien say Rachel Yoon's name. She heard his voice shift into a register she hadn't heard from him before. Not calm, urgent. He ended the call. She's not responding, he said. She published 3 hours ago, Yuna said. She could be. She's not responding to any contact, and her office says she left the building 90 minutes ago for a source meeting. He looked at Avery. The article is live. The documentation is published. But if they get to Yoon and create enough noise about source credibility, the story doesn't die, Avery said, but it gets complicated. It gives them time. She was out of the vehicle before she'd finished the sentence. Where is her building? Avery? Damien. She looked at him through the open door. Where is her building? He looked at her for 1 second, then he said an address to the driver. They moved through afternoon Seoul traffic in a way that disregarded several laws. Avery held the door grip and kept her breathing deliberate and did not think about what they might find or not find. The thinking was useful, the catastrophizing was not. She had learned this in emergency medicine. You thought about the action in front of you and the action after that, and you did not think about outcomes until the actions were complete. The area outside Rachel Yoon's office building was normal, too normal. The particular normalcy of a location just before or just after something, when the air hadn't caught up with events yet. She didn't know which side of the line they were on until she saw the car. Black sedan, running, parked badly at the building's side entrance. Engine still warm. She registered this as she passed it, a professional habit of assessment that she'd never tried to train out of herself. Driver's door not fully closed. She was inside the building before Damien finished telling his people where to position. The lobby was empty of the particular emptiness of evacuated spaces. The security desk unmanned. She went for the stairwell because elevators were confinement, and she went up without counting floors because Yoon's bureau was on the 5th, and she'd registered it when they came this morning. She heard the voices before she reached the floor. 2 male voices, Korean, and then a third voice, Rachel's, sharp and controlled and afraid in the specific way of someone holding fear together by force of will. She came through the stairwell door onto the 5th floor corridor. At the far end, outside the bureau's glass-fronted office, 2 men she didn't know had Rachel Yoon in the physical arrangement that was not quite holding her but was close enough to be the same thing. One of them had her bag, was going through her bag with the systematic efficiency of someone looking for specific objects, drives, phones, the physical documentation she'd been given that morning. Rachel saw Avery first. Her eyes moved. The men didn't see Avery yet. Avery had 4 seconds before they turned. She used them to pick up the fire extinguisher from the bracket on the corridor wall, heavy, cold, real in her hands, and she crossed the distance between them before the second had finished. The first man turned at the sound of her steps, and she swung the extinguisher into the space between them with a force that surprised her, and apparently surprised him considerably more. He went into the wall. The second man dropped the bag and moved toward her, and she had a single clear moment of understanding that she was significantly outmatched in terms of physical confrontation and made the only adjustment available to her, which was to use the extinguisher's discharge function directly into his face. White chemical cloud. He stopped moving toward her and started moving away from her. Rachel grabbed her bag off the floor. The first man was getting up. Damien came through the stairwell door. What followed took less than 90 seconds, and she would never have a precise account of it because she was focused on Rachel and on getting Rachel moving and on keeping herself between Rachel and anyone trying to stop that movement. She heard sounds that indicated the men's situation was being managed, and she did not look back to confirm because looking back was not the action in front of her. They came out through the stairwell exit into the side street. Cold air. The sound of the city. Rachel Yoon, beside her, was breathing in the sharp, deliberate way of someone who had just understood what nearly happened to them and had chosen to process that information later. "My drives," Rachel said. She was checking her bag. They were still looking when you—" She stopped, looked at Avery. Her hair was across her face and she didn't move it. "You hit a man with a fire extinguisher." "I used the discharge mechanism on the second one." Rachel looked at her for a moment. "The article has 40,000 shares," she said, "in 3 hours." She pulled the hair back from her face. Her hands were steady. "The wire service has already sent it to their international partners for distribution. It's out of my hands now. They can't take it back." Avery leaned against the wall of the building. Her shoulder ached from the extinguisher's weight, and her breathing was doing something complicated that she needed to address. She pressed the back of her hand against the wall, cold, real. Damien came out of the exit behind them. A look at Rachel, a look at Avery. She saw him register the state of both of them, the efficiency of the assessment. And then he looked at the street. "We have 30 minutes, he said, "before this location is flagged." "The story is running," Rachel said. "My editor in New York has the full documentation package. The 2 international bodies that were on your list," she looked at Damien, "received copies at the same time the article published. I set that up this morning." Damien looked at her for a moment. "You set it up this morning?" "You weren't the only person in that room thinking 2 steps ahead." She pulled her jacket straight. "What happens now?" Now, Damien said, we go to the chairman. Avery looked at him. Not physically, he said. We go to him the only way left. He held up the phone. He's going to call. He's been watching the story for 3 hours, and his lawyer hasn't been able to stop it, and his prosecutor contact is compromised, and Cha's statement is 40 minutes from going public through the medical board's press office. He looked at the phone. He's going to call because men like Lim Byung-chul, when they've exhausted every structural option, always try the personal approach last. They always believe they can talk their way through the final door. Rachel looked at Avery. He'll try to negotiate. He'll try to, Avery said. The phone rang. Not the secure line. Avery's phone. The one Yuna had given her. The untraceable one. The number she had given to almost no one. It rang with a number she didn't recognize, and she knew, before she answered it, exactly who was on the other end. Because Damien had just told her, and because she had spent the past 9 days learning how this network operated, and personal contact through an unexpected channel was precisely what he would try. She looked at Damien. He nodded. She answered. Dr. Bennett. The voice was measured, deep, accustomed to being listened to. The voice of a man who had run one of the most powerful healthcare networks in the country for 2 decades, and had never once, in those 2 decades, been in a position where the structural protections had failed. I think it's time we spoke directly. Yes, she said. Her voice was steady. She was mildly surprised by how steady it was. I think it is. I want you to understand that the situation as it currently appears in the media is substantially more complicated than Director Lim. She said it clean and flat. I have 31 names, patients removed from transplant priority positions in the past 18 months. 4 of them died. I have the authorization documents with your CFO's signature and the transplant division head's signature and a voluntary statement from Dr. Cha to the medical board that was logged at 7:23 this morning. She paused. What did you want to speak about? The silence on the line was 7 seconds long. She could hear him breathing. She could hear, in that breathing, the specific sound of a man encountering a door where he expected an opening and finding the door. She waited. The 7 seconds became 10. She heard him breathing, and she did not fill the silence because the silence was doing work, and she understood that now. She understood it in the way she understood the operating room, that sometimes the most important thing you could do was hold position and let the situation develop without interference. What do you want? Lim said finally. It was a different question than the one she'd expected. Not denial, not threat. What do you want? The question of a man who had moved past the stage where denial was useful and had arrived at the stage where negotiation seemed like the remaining option. She recognized the stage. She'd seen it in families in waiting rooms, in patients who'd received a diagnosis they couldn't argue with, in the moment when the body stopped fighting the truth and started asking what came next. I don't want anything from you, she said. The documentation is published. The international bodies have it. Dr. Cha's statement is 40 minutes from going public. What happens next doesn't require your participation. She paused. I'm telling you that so you understand that this call is not a negotiation. Then why are you still on the line? She thought about that for a moment. About Park Yoon-soo, 63, mild hypertension, who had come in for a routine surgery and had died because a chain of decisions made in executive offices had compromised the system that was supposed to save him. About the 4 people on the waiting list. About Lee Soo-jin going home to her children. About Damien standing in the side street in the cold looking at a phone that hadn't rung yet. Because I wanted you to hear a person, she said, not a source, not a liability, not a problem to be managed. Her voice was even. Park Yoon-soo had a daughter. Her name is Min Ah. She waited on the 2nd floor while her father died on the 6th floor because the people who were supposed to protect the integrity of that operating room decided protecting their procurement contracts was more important. She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. I wanted you to know that I know her name, and I wanted you to hear me say it. Silence. Goodbye, Director Lim, she said. She ended the call. Her hand dropped to her side. The phone was warm from being held so tightly. Around her, the side street was still doing what side streets did. A delivery truck, a woman with a bicycle, the distant layered noise of the city going about its afternoon, and she stood in the middle of it and let her breathing do what it needed to do. Rachel Yoon was watching her. Damien was watching her. She didn't look at either of them for a moment. Then she looked at Damien. "It's done," she said. He looked at her for a long time. The afternoon light was the low copper of late autumn, and it was doing something particular to the street, making everything look slightly more deliberate than it was, the way light sometimes organized a scene into meaning it hadn't chosen. His face in that light was the face of a man arriving somewhere he'd been walking toward for a very long time and finding it looked different than he'd imagined. "Not quite," he said quietly, "but close." Lim Byung-chul was arrested at 8:47 p.m. Avery was not present for the arrest. She learned about it from Yuna, who received word through a contact in the prosecutor's office. Not Kim, the compromised one, but a second prosecutor, one Damien had apparently maintained as a separate channel for exactly this kind of contingency, a backup she hadn't known about until Yuna mentioned it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone referencing infrastructure that had always existed. She was sitting in the back of a vehicle when she got the news, parked on a street she didn't know well, eating half a convenience store onigiri that tasted like nothing, and was nevertheless the first food she'd had in 11 hours. She put the second half down when Yuna told her, sat with it for a moment. Han, the CFO, was detained 2 hours later as he attempted to board a flight out of Incheon. The airport surveillance notification came through Damien's network first, and the official confirmation came through the newswire 40 minutes after that. Choi was not detained that night. Choi was not detained for 3 more days, and the manner of his detention was quiet. No press, no public statement, the kind of arrest that happened when the people orchestrating it understood that a man like Choi was more useful as a cooperating source than as a public villain. Avery learned this detail later, much later. She filed it in the category of things that were not clean and never would be, and were nonetheless real. Julian gave his formal statement to investigators on the second day. She wasn't present for that either. She received a message from him, 3 sentences, no preamble, that said he understood she wouldn't respond, that he wasn't asking her to, and that he had told investigators everything, including the things that were most damaging to his own position. She read it once and put her phone down and went back to what she'd been doing, which was helping Yuna organize the final documentation package for the international body's formal review. She did not respond to the message. She thought about it, and then she didn't respond. And the not responding was not a decision made from anger, but from the understanding that some distances, once created, had their own integrity and shouldn't be crossed back over just because the person on the other side had finally said the right thing. The medical board's formal proceedings against Dr. Cha Min-seok began the following week. His voluntary cooperation statement was entered into the record and weighed against his 9-year participation in the authorization structure. The outcome: suspension, required remediation, potential reinstatement under conditions, was not what Avery would have written in a world where she wrote outcomes. It was what the institution produced when given the full information and a cooperating subject. She had given them the full information. The outcome was theirs. She told herself this with moderate success. Her own medical license review was initiated by the board 11 days after the story broke, under a different mandate than the one the hospital had used, a formal examination of the original accusations in light of the new evidence. She attended 2 hearings. At the first one, she was represented by an attorney she'd found through Rachel Yoon's recommendation. At the second one, she was largely silent while the documentation was reviewed and the timeline was reconstructed and the anesthesia coverage failure was attributed correctly and officially to the procurement decision made 3 months prior to Park Yun-soo's surgery. The license restoration came through on a Thursday morning. Yuna texted her a single line. She was buying coffee at the time. Real coffee. From a place near where she'd been staying, a small place that knew her order by the 3rd day. She read the text and paid for the coffee and went outside and stood on the sidewalk in the November cold and drank it. She thought about calling her mother. She'd been thinking about calling her mother for 3 weeks and had made the call twice, and both times it had been inadequate in the way of calls that attempted to describe things that didn't compress into conversation. Her mother had said, both times, that she needed to come home. She had said both times that she would. She stood on the sidewalk and drank the coffee and looked at Seoul in November. Gray sky, the particular smell of the season, the specific noise of a city that had been her home for 19 months and had tried, at the worst moment, to eject her. And she understood that she was not going home. Or she was, but not to the address her mother meant. She'd been thinking about the empty building on the east side of the city. Not Hansol, different district, different character, a former clinic that had closed 2 years ago due to funding issues that were entirely unrelated to corruption and had simply been a function of an underserved area not generating sufficient revenue for the network that had owned it. She'd driven past it 3 times in the past week, once deliberately, twice because the route she was taking passed it and she had not adjusted her route. She finished the coffee. She went to find Damien. He was where he often was in the mornings, at the table in the current apartment, which was the 4th location they'd used since the safe house outside the city and the most functional, with Yuna's maps and the operational materials that were slowly, over the past 2 weeks, shifting in character from active investigation architecture to documentation and archival work, the shift that happened when the acute phase was over and the long institutional phase began. He looked up when she came in. He looked at her face. "The board," he said. "License restored. Full reinstatement, effective immediately. All accusations formally withdrawn from the record." She sat down across from him. "I want to talk about the building on Namdaemun Row." He was quiet for a moment. "The old Isu clinic. It has functional infrastructure, operating rooms that need updating but structurally sound, patient capacity for 40. The neighborhood's emergency care access is 14 kilometers to the nearest trauma-equipped facility," he said. She looked at him. "You've looked at it." "I looked at everything in a 10-kilometer radius around where you've been walking for the past week." He held her gaze with the particular steadiness she'd spent 19 days learning to read. "I had Yuna pull the building records 2 days ago." She sat with that for a moment. "Why?" "Because I was going to suggest it if you didn't." He looked at the table, then back at her. "The humanitarian foundation, the one I've been building the framework for, the legitimate replacement for the network I'm dismantling. It needs a medical component that's functional, not decorative, something that does actual work." He paused. "A nonprofit emergency trauma center in an underserved district does actual work. I'd need staff, equipment, a consistent funding structure that doesn't depend on, I know what it needs." He said it simply. "I've been thinking about it for 9 days." She looked at him across the table, at the face she'd first seen by the Han River in the dark, the face that had been difficult to read and had become, over 19 days of close proximity to consequences, considerably less opaque. Not open. That wasn't the right word. But visible, in the specific way of things that had been behind glass for a long time and had shifted incrementally to the near side of it. "You're financing it," she said, "to start, until it can sustain itself through the nonprofit structure." He looked at her. "I need you to understand that I'm doing this because it's the right architecture for what comes next. Not because—" He stopped. "Not because—" she said. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his face that she recognized because she'd felt the equivalent of it. The morning her license came through, standing on the sidewalk with the coffee going cold. The feeling of arriving at a place where the vocabulary you'd been using for a long time no longer covered the territory. "Not only because," he said. She held his gaze. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Indifferent, layered, moving through its rhythms without reference to any particular person's interior weather. She had loved that about it once, in the early months, when she was new and the indifference felt like freedom. She thought she might be arriving at a version of it again. A different version, one that knew what the city was capable of and loved it anyway, which was the only honest way to love anything. "The building has 6 exam rooms on the 2nd floor that could function as intake triage," she said. "Yuna's notes say the HVAC needs full replacement. The surgical suite on the 3rd floor is salvageable. Probably 60% of the equipment can be restored. There's a loading dock on the south side that could be converted to ambulance access." She looked at him. He looked at her. "When can I see it?" she said. "This afternoon," he said. "If you want." She looked at the table for a moment. At the maps, the files, the architecture of everything they'd built, and everything it had cost. She thought about Lee Soo-jin, 44, 2 children, who had gone home. She thought about Min Ah, who had buried her father and had been contacted by investigators, and had given a statement that was, by all accounts, precise and complete, and delivered without apparent hesitation. The daughter who had gotten good at hiding fear, and had, in the end, not needed to hide it. She thought about what Damien had said in the car the first night, and the question that she'd never fully answered because she hadn't known the answer then. Do you want the truth or revenge? She understood now that the question was not a binary, that truth, pursued long enough, and at sufficient cost, had a way of becoming its own form of both. This afternoon, she said. They went at 3 o'clock. Yuna came. One of the men whose name she now knew, his name was Jay, drove them. The building on Namdaemun Row was exactly what it looked like from the outside, an ending that hadn't decided yet what it was going to become. 2 stories of concrete and glass, the glass filmed with the particular gray of long vacancy, a hand-lettered sign on the door that had been weathering for 2 years. Damien had a key. She didn't ask how. Inside, the smell of vacancy. Flat, neutral, the smell of spaces that had been human and had been left to themselves. The floors were sound. The walls needed work. She walked through the intake corridor and through what had been the waiting area and through the door to the exam rooms with the particular attention she gave to operating spaces, reading the room in terms of function, of workflow, of the movement of bodies in crisis. She stood in the 3rd-floor surgical suite for several minutes. The equipment was older than she'd have chosen, but Yuna had been right. Salvageable, more than 60%, with the right contractor and the right supply chain. A legitimate supply chain. The thought arrived with an irony that wasn't funny and wasn't not funny. Damien stood in the doorway of the surgical suite and watched her move through the space. He didn't speak. She'd come to understand that about him, that he watched closely and spoke when speaking added something, and that the watching wasn't passive. It was the same quality of attention he brought to everything, the attention of a man who had learned at significant cost not to be careless with what he saw. It'll take 4 months, she said, to be functional, minimum. I know. I'll need to hire. There's a residency program at Yonsei that places graduates who want community medicine. I know someone in the department, knew someone. She may not want contact from me right now. She'll want contact, Damien said. The story changed what contact with you means. She stood in the middle of the surgical suite and looked at the equipment and the walls and the window that showed the district below. Not beautiful, not ugly, just real. The realness of a neighborhood that needed what this building could eventually provide. My mother wants me to come home, she said. I know. He said it without asking how he knew, which meant Yuna had mentioned it, or he'd noticed something she'd said. She didn't press. I'm going to visit her, Avery said. 2 weeks, maybe 3. When the initial setup is far enough along that I can leave it for a while. That's reasonable. She turned and looked at him. He was still in the doorway, leaning against the frame with the slight ease of someone who had made a decision about where to be and had settled into it. The afternoon light came through the filmed window at an angle and made the dust visible in the air between them. Countless small particles, doing nothing, going nowhere in particular, held in the light for this moment, and no other. You'll be here when I come back, she said. It was not quite a question. He held her gaze for a long moment. The Foundation's legal restructuring takes 8 months. I'll be in Seoul for most of that. That's not what I asked. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted through several things that she watched and didn't name, because they didn't need names yet, because the space between what something was and what you called it was sometimes the most important space, and filling it too fast was a way of losing it. Yes, he said. I'll be here. She nodded. She looked back at the surgical suite, at the equipment and the floor and the window, at what this space was going to become. She thought about this first night, the river, the cold, the coat on her shoulders, the door she'd gotten into without knowing why. She thought about how that moment had felt like the end of everything and had been, instead, the door to a version of things she couldn't have anticipated or designed or chosen in advance. The version where the losing of everything turned out to be the condition required for building something that was actually hers. Not the career she'd inherited from the expectations of other people. Not the relationship she'd poured herself into without ever asking whether the vessel could hold. Not the identity of the competent foreigner proving herself in rooms that didn't want her. Something else. Something that started with a building that smelled like vacancy and a supply chain that needed to be rebuilt from the ground and a neighborhood that had 14 kilometers between it and the nearest trauma unit. Something that started with what she knew how to do, which was keep people alive and built outward from there. She walked to the window of the surgical suite and looked out at the district below. The street level, the small businesses, the people going about the late afternoon movement of a city that didn't stop for anyone's interior reckoning. Somewhere below, and to the left, there was a school. She could see the edge of it. Somewhere further east, there was a community market that operated 3 days a week. She'd noticed these things on her walks, without knowing yet what she was noticing them for. Now she knew. The investigation formally concluded over the following months, in the way of large institutional proceedings, not with a single moment of resolution, but with an accumulation of them, decisions and findings and announcements that arrived in pieces and had to be assembled into understanding over time. Director Lim was indicted on charges that filled 4 pages. Han's financial records revealed a structure that expanded the pharmaceutical network beyond Korea into 3 additional countries, a discovery that triggered investigations in 2 of those countries and formal inquiries in the 3rd. The transplant waiting list manipulation was classified separately, under a statute that carried harsher penalties, because the prosecutors who had taken over the case from the compromised Kim had decided, apparently, that the correct framing was not fraud, but something closer to what it actually was. Julian's medical license was suspended for 2 years pending a conduct review. She read about it in a news summary Yuna forwarded without comment. She sat with the feeling the news produced in her for a while. The feeling was not satisfaction. It was not the clean resolution of an old wound. It was something more complicated. The feeling of a thing having been weighed correctly, imperfectly, by imperfect hands doing the best they could with what was in front of them. Which was, she had come to understand, the only kind of justice that actually existed in the world. The other kind was a theory. Rachel Yoon's coverage won a journalism prize. Avery attended the ceremony, which was more ceremony than she was accustomed to, and watched Rachel receive the recognition in the particular way of people who knew exactly what the work had cost and had not yet decided how to hold the prize alongside the cost. They had a drink afterward, just the 2 of them, at a place Rachel knew near the river. "Are you staying?" Rachel asked. "Yes," Avery said. Rachel looked at her. "You're different than when I opened the door at 6 in the morning." It was a different morning. It was 9 weeks ago. 9 weeks ago was a long time ago. Rachel drank her drink. She looked at the river through the window. The Han at night, the lights, the wide, dark water. "He's in the news," she said. "The foundation, the restructuring." "I know." "Are you—" She stopped, reconsidered. "Is it good? Whatever it is." Avery looked at the water, at the specific place on the bank, visible from this angle, where she'd sat 9 weeks ago with a cardboard box and nothing left. She could see it, but not precisely. The lights obscured the exact location. The distance flattened detail. She looked at it anyway. "It's honest," she said. "That's enough for now." The clinic opened on a Thursday in February, the kind of day that couldn't decide between winter and the approach of something warmer. Avery had been sleeping 4 hours a night for 3 weeks, which was not enough and was also nothing she wasn't used to. The staff she'd hired, 6 people to start, all of them coming from programs or positions where they'd wanted this kind of work and hadn't had the structure to do it, were in the building by 7. The equipment was functional. The ambulance access on the south side worked. The HVAC ran without complaint. The first patient arrived at 8:14 a.m. A man, 57, who had walked 6 blocks from his apartment with a laceration on his forearm that he'd been ignoring for 2 days because the nearest facility with a reasonable wait time was the 14 kilometers east, and he worked early mornings and couldn't lose the time. The laceration needed cleaning and 4 sutures and a course of antibiotics. It took 22 minutes. She did it herself. She'd intended to observe the first morning, to let her staff move through the space and find their rhythm, but she was in the intake corridor when he came through the door, and she assessed him and took him to the second-floor exam room and did it herself. Afterward, the man looked at his bandaged arm and said something she almost caught. Her Korean was better than it had been, better than almost anyone had expected it to become, because 9 weeks of living inside a situation that required it had done more for her language acquisition than 19 months of comfortable expatriate life. He said something about not expecting anyone to be open yet, that he'd seen the sign and tried the door without expecting it to work. She told him it worked. She told him to come back in 5 days to have the sutures checked. He nodded. He left. She stood in the exam room alone for a moment. The room smelled like antiseptic and the specific neutrality of a medical space that had just been used for the first time. She looked at the suture tray, the gloves, the small, real mess of a wound treated correctly. Then she went downstairs to see who came next. Damien came at the end of the day. Not announced. She heard the door and looked up from the intake desk where she'd been reviewing the day's record, 7 patients in total, small numbers that were also a beginning. And he was in the doorway in the same dark jacket looking at the space with the particular attention he brought to everything. She watched him look at it. At the intake desk, the waiting area, the hallway that led to the exam rooms. At the sign above the desk that Jay had installed 2 days ago. Plain letters, nothing elaborate. The name she'd given the clinic, which was not her name and not Damien's name, but the name she'd arrived at after 3 weeks of considering what you called a place that existed because people had died and because one woman had gotten into a car she didn't understand and because a man had spent 15 years building towards something and had found, at the end of it, that what he'd built was also a door. She'd named it after Mina's father. Not ostentatiously. The full name wasn't on the sign. Just a word from his name. A character that meant something in Korean that she'd asked Yuna to help her find and that translated, approximately, as the word for persisting or for enduring or for continuing forward despite the weight of things. Damien looked at the sign for a moment. He came to the desk. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them was the desk and the day's intake record, and the antiseptic smell of a clinic that had been open for 11 hours and had seen 7 people and had done what it was built to do. "How was it?" he said. She thought about the man with the laceration, about the afternoon patient, a woman with her daughter, a child with an ear infection that had been building for a week, about the last patient of the day, an elderly man brought in by his neighbor, dehydrated and confused in a way that resolved with fluids and a slow hour of monitoring and sent her home at the end of his shift, looking steadier than he'd arrived. About the 6 people on her staff moving through the space with the quiet competence of people doing work they'd wanted to do and now had the structure to do it in. "It was a beginning," she said. Damien looked at her for a moment. Something crossed his face. The thing she'd been watching cross his face for 9 weeks, the thing that had no precise name and didn't need one yet. "A beginning," he said. "Yes." He reached into his jacket. He set something on the desk between them. The photograph. His father and Lim Byung-chul, 15 years ago, the hotel lobby or reception, his father laughing at something. She looked at it. "I've been carrying it for 15 years, he said. "I don't want to carry it anymore." She looked at the photograph, and then at him. At his face in the fading light of a February evening in a clinic that smelled like antiseptic and beginning. At the particular expression of a man who had arrived at the end of the road he'd been on and was standing at the place where the road ended and the rest of it was unmapped. "What do you want to do with it?" she said. He looked at it for a moment. "I think I want to leave it here," he said. "If that's all right." She looked at the photograph, at the face of the man who had been 51 with no history of heart disease and had made a phone call 2 days before he died that his son had carried like a stone for 15 years. At the evidence of a life interrupted before it could complete its intention. "There's a space on the wall," she said. "In the back office. I haven't put anything there yet." He picked the photograph up. He looked at it one more time, not the way you looked at something you were trying to memorize, but the way you looked at something you were releasing, which was carefully and without flinching and with the understanding that the looking was the last part of the carrying. Then he came around the desk. She walked with him to the back office, small, functional, A window that looked out at the south side of the building, the ambulance access, the street beyond it going about its evening. He put the photograph on the wall. They stood and looked at it for a moment. Outside, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, breathing, continuing forward in the way of things that didn't stop for anyone's interior weather, which was also the way of things that endured. She thought about the first night, the river, the cardboard box, the coat on her shoulders, and the questions she'd been asked and the door she'd gone through without knowing what was on the other side. She thought about what was on the other side. 7 patients, 6 staff, a surgical suite that worked, an ambulance door that opened correctly, a man beside her in a back office at the end of the first day of something that was also the end of something else. And the difference between those two things was thin enough that you could see through it if the light was right. She looked at the photograph one more time, then she turned toward the door and the rest of it.